In less than a week from now, we will know the result of the first college football game of the year, and that will be between Iowa State and Kansas State. On paper, the coolest part about this game should be the fact that it's in Ireland, but when you do a deep dive into the series of these two teams, it actually has one of the more interesting rivalries in college football history. It's come to be known as Farmageddon, and it's kind of cool this is the first game of the 2025 season, so I think it deserves a spotlight. In today's video, we're to go through the bizarre history of this game, why it's called Farmageddon, and then obviously, I'm going to give my prediction for this year's game. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you need to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's go ahead and get started, and talk about the bizarre history of Farmageddon. Now this game is actually one of the oldest and longest running rivalries in college football, without a yearly gap between games. K-State and Iowa State first played each other back in 1917 as members of the Missouri Valley Conference. This was back when Missouri Valley was basically the Big Eight with a few other small schools, and Iowa State was actually one of its first members in the conference. They joined in 1907 with their football team playing in 1908, and K-State didn't join until 1913, and they didn't play each other on the football field for 4 years. The first game would take place in Ames, Iowa, and Iowa State won 10-7. When the game went back to Manhattan the next year, K-State won 11-0. Iowa State would win the next 3 games, and then K-State would win 1 game before the series had its first tie in 1923. In 1928, when both K-State and Iowa State were part of a conference split, Iowa State led the series 8-3-1. K-State would then go 7-1 over the next 8 games, bringing the 20-game total to 9 wins for the Cyclones and 10 for the Cats. Something that's very interesting about this game is that it stayed relatively close to even throughout its entire history, but there have been multiple long streaks of wins for each team, and that's something you'll see as the years go on. But through the majority of the rivalries run throughout its history, it wasn't really all that much of a rivalry. They played each other all the time, but neither of the two teams were all that competitive in the conference. From 1928 to 1998, Kansas State only won 1 conference title in 1934, and Iowa State didn't win any, since their only conference titles are in 1911 and 1912. But during that time frame, each team had different winning streaks. Iowa State won 10 games from 1943 to 1952, and 7 from 1974 to 1980, and K-State won 6 straight games from 1953 to 1958, and 5 games from 1932 to 1936. While Iowa State was bad, K-State was even worse. In 1989, they were by far the worst team in the conference and the worst major college football program. They were at a point where they were losing to middle-of-the-road FCS teams. They were one of the only Big 8 teams that Iowa State was consistently able to beat, but then K-State hired Bill Snyder in 1989. During Snyder's original run from 1989 to 2005, his record against Iowa State was 13-4. On the other sideline, Dan McCarney was Iowa State's head coach from 1995 to 2006. His career at Iowa State would be up and down. While he did have some really good players come through the program, like Seneca Wallace, who was one of the most underrated players in Big 12 history, running back Troy Davis ran for over 4,000 yards and 36 touchdowns, and he never figured out how to beat Snyder. He would only beat K-State twice in 2004 and 2005, but those would be the last games Bill Snyder would coach at K-State before retiring. When Snyder retired, K-State brought in Ron Prince to coach from 2006 to 2008, and those were some interesting K-State teams with players like Jordy Nelson and Josh Freeman, but they weren't all that good. The good news for K-State is that Iowa State was even worse. They went 1-2 against K-State during that time frame, fired McCarney, and would hire Gene Chizik, who would later go on to coach at Auburn. He only coached there for 2 years, so they then hired Paul Rhodes in 2009. K-State had enough of the Ron Prince nonsense, so they brought in a new head coach too, Bill Snyder again. Coach Snyder's return actually coincided with the game starting to get pretty interesting, and it could turn into a real rivalry. In 2009, there was a lot of uneasiness around the future of the Big 12, with a whole bunch of teams openly talking about leaving and going to the Pac-12, Big 10, or even the SEC. K-State and Iowa State were pretty much the only two teams that didn't have much talk about them leaving. Neither team had much of a rivalry with each other at that point because they'd both been historically pretty bad, and they were both kind of middle-of-the-road teams at that point. But Iowa State's only real other rivals in the conference were Missouri and Nebraska, and K-State's rival of Kansas was mostly focused on Mizzou. So, the Big 12 Conference as a whole drummed up an idea for two teams to play a neutral site game that would be billed as a rivalry matchup. They had played uninterrupted for nearly 100 years at this point, and a 2-game series was announced to be played at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, and the game was stated to be called Farmageddon, which was a reference to the fact that both teams are land-grant schools who were historically farm schools. K-State would win both versions of that game. They won the 2009 one 24-23, and the 2010 version 27-20. Looking back, those two games ended pretty crazily. The 2009 game ended on a blocked field goal, and if those games weren't as close as they were, I don't think it would have become the rivalry it is today, but that didn't mean it didn't continue to get really weird. In 2011, a 16th ranked K-State team only beat Iowa State 30-23, led by an unknown quarterback named Colin Klein. In 2012, the number 6 ranked K-State team only beat Iowa State by 6 points in Ames. In 2015, K-State beat Iowa State off of a crazy last-second field goal in Manhattan, and then 2 years later in 2017, Skylar Thompson scored a touchdown with no time left on the clock and walked off to win 20-19. In 2018, Iowa State finally won their first version of the game since 2007, and Snyder would retire after that year. This would make it the second time that Iowa State made Snyder retire, and the way these games have been played and the way that they end is a huge reason why it's considered such a big rivalry in the Big 12 today, because no matter how good either team is, something weird always seems to happen, and the game is impossible to predict. They would do it under a new coach. After that walk-off field goal game in 2015, Iowa State would fire Paul Rhodes as their head man, and he finished his time in Ames with a record of 32-15 and an 0-7 record against Kansas State. To replace him, Iowa State signed Matt Campbell from Toledo, and Coach Campbell turned things around pretty much overnight. They went 3-9 in his first year, and then went 8-5. When Coach Snyder retired in 2018, K-State brought in Iowa native Chris Kleiman from North Dakota State to be their head coach. Campbell was a program builder at Toledo, and Kleiman was a program maintainer at North Dakota State, and they went to work just doing that at their new schools. The 2019 version of the game was the first matchup between head coaches, and Chris Kleiman's Wildcats won 27-17. That was the last game that would be normal. The next year, Matt Campbell's Cyclones would win 45-0 in a huge blowout. It was the biggest win in the series since K-State won 58-7 in 2002, and then they'd win 33-20 in Manhattan the following year. In 2022 though, K-State would find their way back into the win column with a really weird 10-9 victory in Ames. In 2023, a snowstorm would drop almost a foot of snow on Manhattan, Kansas, and Iowa State would win the game 42-25 despite not scoring a single touchdown in the red zone. Every single one of their scores was on a breakaway run or pass. The first play of the game was a 71-yard touchdown run in the snow, followed by a 77-yard touchdown run, a 79-yard touchdown pass, a 60-yard touchdown run, a 33-yard touchdown run, and an 82-yard touchdown pass. Almost every touchdown was scored on a blown coverage, leaving someone wide open or a really bad tackle attempt in the snow, meaning that if K-State could just play fundamental football, they probably could have won 35-7. They lost instead. Last year's game, Iowa State won 29-21 in Ames after Avery Johnson fumbled the ball in the first play and got an intentional grounding penalty in the end zone for a safety. This game is always weird and doesn't make any sense for either team. It doesn't help that most of the games that have been played over the last 10 or 15 years have been one score or close ones. If you ignore the big blowouts in 2013 and 2020, Iowa State currently leads the series 54-50 and 4. Like I said before, this year's game will be the third time it's been played outside of Ames or Manhattan, but it might honestly be one of the most important games in the series' history. When the Big 12 expanded to 16 teams, they created a schedule matrix that only protected a few rivalries, and Farmageddon wasn't protected. So in 2027, the game will not be played at all. It has been played 110 times in a row at that point, making it one of the longest uninterrupted streaks in college football history, but the reason why it's important is this team is huge for the college football playoff and Big 12 championship stuff. Both K-State and Iowa State are projected frontrunners in the Big 12 conference this year, as Iowa State made the championship game last year, and despite losing a lot of talent to the NFL, they're still led by a really talented quarterback in Rocco Becht. Rocco took the college football world by storm last year, throwing for 3,500 yards and 25 touchdowns, and leading Iowa State to an 11-3 record, and a loss to Arizona State in the Big 12 championship game. They were also led by a breakout running back in Carson Hansen, who ran for 752 yards and 13 touchdowns, and they also still have Abu Sama, who pretty much beat K-State by himself in 2023. On the other hand, K-State went 9-4 with a bowl win over Rutgers, but it was pretty much considered a disappointing season, including their 29-21 loss to Iowa State. Avery Johnson finished with 2,700 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 10 picks, and this was his first full year as a starter. He also ran for over 600 yards on the ground. DJ Giddens went off to the NFL draft, but Dylan Edwards, the backup, ended up coming back this season, and he will be the main starter. The winner of this game will probably be in the driver's seat for the conference from the get-go, and the loser will either have a really tough road back or will instantly be out of the race. I know I've said this game has been pretty close to 500 throughout its history, and that's true, but Matt Campbell has owned Kansas State since taking over as head coach, and Iowa State is 5-4 since K-State took over, and Chris Kleiman is only 2-4 against the Cyclones since he took over. At a neutral site in Week 0 in Ireland, this game is going to come down to coaching and practice, and I personally think Kansas State should have the upper hand, but I don't know. Iowa State might be better coached and might be more ready to play, and if I had to put money on it, I would probably pick K-State, but I would not be shocked if Iowa State pulls this one off. But what do you guys think? If you're an Iowa State or a Kansas State fan, who do you think will win this game? What do you think of the rivalry? And what's another rivalry I should spotlight on the channel next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out some of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.